He thought his badge made him untouchable. Until he arrested the wrong woman. A single mistake cost him everything. But what happens next? You won't believe it. Ryland Brooks had always dreamed of power. As the son of a decorated police captain, he had grown up believing that wearing a badge meant being in control. He had spent his childhood watching his father command respect with just his presence, and he had learned early on that authority was everything. The moment he graduated from the academy and clipped his badge onto his uniform, Ryland felt invincible. He wasn't just some rookie, he was a man of the law. He had the power to enforce order, to decide who was guilty, and to make sure justice was served, at least as he saw it. Unlike some of his colleagues, Ryland didn't waste time trying to understand people. He didn't care about stories, excuses, or explanations. He believed that if someone got arrested, they had it coming. Simple as that. He wasn't one of those weak cops who second-guessed themselves. He was efficient, firm, and, in his mind, always right. Late one evening, as he cruised through an upscale neighborhood, a call came through his radio. Suspicious individual loitering near a residence on West Elm Street. Female, dark clothing. Possible break-in attempt. Ryland smirked. Another one. He loved these cases, the ones where he could swoop in, flex his authority, and take someone off the streets before they could cause trouble. Pulling up to the location, he spotted a woman standing near the driveway of a large modern home. She was tall and slender, with dark hair that fell past her shoulders. She was wearing a long coat, and her posture was relaxed, almost too casual for someone who wasn't up to something. Ryland stepped out of his car, his hand already resting on his holster. "Hey! You! Hands where I can see them." The woman turned slowly, her icy blue eyes locking onto his with an expression of mild annoyance rather than fear. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm. Ryland didn't like that. Innocent people were usually nervous when confronted by a cop. The confident ones? They were the real troublemakers. "ID, now." She tilted her head slightly, as if assessing him. Then, without breaking eye contact, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. She flicked it open, revealing a driver's license. Laurel Satter, he read aloud. The name meant nothing to him. "I live here," she said evenly. "I'm waiting for my husband to get home." "Is there a problem, officer?" Ryland narrowed his eyes. This was how it always went, smooth talk, fake stories. He had heard it all before. "Yeah, there's a problem," he said, stepping closer. "We got a report about a suspicious person in the area. You match the description." Laurel sighed, shifting her weight. "I matched the description of, standing in my own driveway." He wasn't in the mood for games. "Turn around, hands behind your back." Her brows lifted in disbelief. "You're joking." "Do I look like I'm joking?" He didn't wait for an answer. Before she could protest, he grabbed her wrist, spinning her around and clicking the handcuffs into place. She stiffened but didn't resist. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice now cold. "Yeah." Ryland smirked, pushing her toward his patrol car. "Tell it to the judge." At that moment, he felt invincible. He was the law, and she was just another name in his report. Another suspect. Another statistic. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that this was the moment his entire life was about to fall apart. Ryland Brooks had processed countless arrests in his short time on the force, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the way the woman carried herself, calm, composed, almost indifferent to what was happening. She didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't yell about her rights like so many others did. She simply sat in the back of his patrol car, staring out the window as he drove her to the station. The silence was unsettling. Usually, people either started making excuses or fumed with anger. But this woman, Laurel Satter, acted as if she was simply waiting for something. You're awfully quiet, Ryland said, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. Laurel met his gaze without hesitation. You're awfully reckless. He smirked, turning his attention back to the road. Yeah. We'll see what the system has to say about that. When they arrived at the station, Ryland escorted her inside, still expecting some kind of reaction. Instead, she simply followed his lead, stepping up to the desk where a tired-looking officer took her information. The officer barely looked up from his computer. Charges? Trespassing, possible attempted burglary, Ryland replied. Laurel let out a short breath, almost a laugh. Ryland ignored it. The officer at the desk finally glanced up, looking between Ryland and Laurel before shaking his head. All right. Sit tight. Laurel was led to a holding cell, but Ryland barely had time to process the paperwork before his radio crackled. Brooks. Get up here. Now. It was his captain's voice. The tone alone made something tighten in Ryland's chest. He set down his pen, straightened his uniform, and walked toward the office. When he stepped inside, the first thing he noticed was the look on Captain Holt's face, somewhere between frustration and barely contained panic. Do you have any idea what you've just done? The captain asked, voice low and deadly. Ryland frowned. I arrested a suspect in a suspected break-in. What's the problem? The problem, Holt snapped, is that you just arrested the daughter of a federal judge. Ryland blinked. What? Laurel Satter. Ring a bell now? Judge Edwin Satter. One of the most powerful judges in the state. And you absolute idiot, put his daughter in handcuffs and dragged her in here like a common criminal. The words hit Ryland like a punch to the gut. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. A judge's daughter? No way. She was standing in her own damn driveway, waiting for her husband. Holt cut him off. And you decided she was a suspect because what? She looked suspicious to you? Ryland opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. For the first time since he had put on his uniform, he felt something foreign, doubt. She's pressing charges, Holt continued, rubbing his temples as if this was giving him a migraine. Unlawful detainment. Excessive force. Violating civil rights. And trust me, she has the power to make sure those charges stick. Ryland's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. This could ruin him. Before he could say anything, a new voice entered the room. I told you you were making a mistake. Ryland turned sharply. Laurel Satter stood in the doorway, arms crossed, looking entirely unbothered by the chaos she had just caused. There was no anger in her expression, no smugness, just quiet certainty, as if she had known all along that this was how things would play out. For the first time in his life, Ryland Brooks felt powerless. Ryland sat in the interrogation room, his jaw tight, his fists clenched under the table. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He was the cop, he was the one who asked the questions, the one in control. But now, he was the one being scrutinized. Outside the room, the precinct was buzzing. His fellow officers spoke in hushed tones, stealing glances in his direction. They all knew what had happened. They all knew who he had arrested. And now, they were all waiting to see how badly this would end for him. The door opened, and Captain Holt stepped in, looking more exhausted than Ryland had ever seen him. He carried a thick folder in one hand, and when he dropped it onto the table, the sound echoed through the room. You really did it this time, Holt muttered, pulling out a chair and sitting across from Ryland. Ryland exhaled sharply through his nose. Look, I didn't know who she was. I was just doing my job. Holt scoffed, rubbing a hand over his face. Your job? Your job is to enforce the law, not play judge, jury, and executioner in some rich neighborhood because you thought someone looked out of place. Ryland's shoulders stiffened. I had probable cause. No, Holt snapped. You thought you had probable cause. There's a difference. And now, because of your arrogance, we have a full-blown disaster on our hands. Ryland clenched his jaw, his frustration mounting. So what? She's some judge's daughter, and now suddenly I'm the bad guy for doing my job. Holt leaned forward, his expression deadly serious. You didn't just arrest the daughter of any judge. You arrested Edwin Satter's daughter. Do you have any idea how powerful that man is? Ryland didn't answer. He's one of the toughest federal judges in the country. He's shut down corrupt cops, exposed dirty departments, and now you have given him the perfect case to rip this place apart. A tense silence filled the room. Ryland finally spoke, his voice quieter now. What's going to happen to me? Holt leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. That depends. On what? On how badly she wants to destroy you. As if on cue, the door opened again, and this time, it wasn't an officer stepping in. It was Laurel Satter. Ryland stiffened at the sight of her, still composed, still exuding that air of effortless authority that had unsettled him from the start. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her, and for a brief moment, no one spoke. Then, in a voice as sharp as a knife, she said, "You don't even realize how badly you've screwed up, do you?" Ryland met her gaze, refusing to back down. "I was doing my job." Laurel tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. "No. You were abusing your power." Ryland's jaw tightened. "You looked suspicious." She let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "I looked suspicious." She shook her head. "You didn't ask me a single question. You didn't assess the situation. You walked in already convinced that I was guilty." "Why?" Ryland opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. Laurel's expression darkened. "This isn't just about me. How many other people have you done this to? How many others didn't have the connections to fight back?" The words hit harder than Ryland wanted to admit. She leaned forward slightly. "You think you're untouchable because of your badge. But you're not." Holt cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Miss Satter, I assume you're here to press formal charges?" Laurel didn't look away from Ryland. "I'm here to make sure he understands exactly what he's done." Ryland swallowed hard. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure what would happen next. Ryland sat alone in his apartment, the dim glow of a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table casting long shadows against the wall. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the city outside, a reminder that life was moving on without him. It had been 2 weeks since his suspension. 2 weeks since his entire world had come crashing down around him. At first, he had refused to believe it. He had told himself it was just a misunderstanding, that the department would back him up, that everything would blow over. But it hadn't. The moment Laurel Satter walked out of that precinct, the media had been waiting. She hadn't even needed to speak, her name alone had set everything in motion. The headlines had been brutal. Officer suspended after wrongful arrest of federal judge's daughter. Abuse of power in the police force, how many more victims? Reporters had camped outside the station for days. His name was everywhere. People who had once been his friends, his supporters, had stopped answering his calls. The department had wasted no time distancing themselves from him. His superiors called it an internal review, but Ryland knew what it really was, they were cutting him loose. He had been placed on indefinite suspension pending investigation. No badge. No gun. No future in law enforcement if the charges stuck. And worst of all, no one had come to his defense. Not his fellow officers. Not his so-called friends. Even his own father, the man who had spent his entire life preaching about the importance of the badge, had simply shaken his head in disappointment. "This job isn't about power, Ryland," his father had told him in their last conversation. "And the fact that you thought it was? That's why you're here now." Rylan had walked out before he could hear anything else. Now, sitting in his apartment with nothing but his own thoughts, the weight of it all was beginning to settle in. He had always believed he was untouchable. That the rules were different for people like him. He had spent years patrolling the streets, making arrests, writing reports, moving from one case to the next without ever stopping to question himself. But now, with everything stripped away, he was forced to ask himself the question he had avoided for so long. Had he been wrong? The thought made him sick. A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his spiral. Rylan groaned, rubbing a hand over his face. He wasn't in the mood for company. Probably another reporter looking for a statement, or worse, someone looking to remind him what a disgrace he had become. He considered ignoring it. Then came another knock, sharper this time. With a heavy sigh, he pushed himself up from the couch, running a hand through his unkempt hair before unlocking the door. The last person he expected to see was Laurel Satter. She stood there, arms crossed, looking just as composed as she had in the interrogation room. Rylan frowned. "What the hell are you doing here?" Laurel didn't flinch. "Can I come in?" He let out a dry laugh. "You serious?" She met his gaze evenly. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." Rylan hesitated. He had no reason to trust her. Hell, she was the reason his life had imploded. But something about the way she looked at him, like she wasn't there to gloat, like she actually had a purpose, made him step aside. Laurel walked in without hesitation, glancing around at the empty beer bottles and unwashed dishes on the counter. "Nice place," she said dryly. "Yeah, well," Rylan muttered, shutting the door behind her. "Unemployment's really helping me work on my interior design." She ignored the comment, turning to face him. "I'm not here to argue with you." "Then what do you want?" "To know if you actually understand what you did," she said simply. Rylan clenched his jaw. "I already apologized in front of a room full of people. What else do you want from me?" Laurel sighed, shaking her head. "I don't care about an apology. I care about whether or not you get it." "Get what?" he snapped. "That I made a mistake. That I screwed up. Trust me, I get it. I've lost everything because of you." Laurel raised an eyebrow. "Because of me?" Rylan exhaled sharply, dragging a hand over his face. "You know what I mean." "No, I don't think I do," she said, stepping closer. "You lost everything because of your own actions. I was just the first person with enough power to fight back." Rylan swallowed hard. He hated how calmly she said it, how effortlessly she exposed the ugly truth he had been trying to ignore. She studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "I came here because I want to give you a choice." He frowned. "What kind of choice?" "You can keep sitting in this apartment, blaming everyone but yourself," she said. "Or you can actually do something about it." Rylan folded his arms. "And what? Join some community outreach program? Volunteer at a soup kitchen?" He let out a bitter laugh. "I think I'll pass." Laurel's expression didn't change. "I'm offering you a chance to make this right. To learn something. But if you're too proud to take it, that's your problem." Rylan stared at her, his pride and anger warring with something else, something he didn't want to name. After a long pause, he muttered, "And if I say no?" Laurel turned toward the door, pausing just long enough to glance at him over her shoulder. "Then you'll prove to everyone that you were never worthy of that badge in the first place." With that, she walked out, leaving Rylan alone in the silence once more. Rylan Brooks sat in his apartment for a long time after Laurel left, staring at the door as if expecting her to walk back in and tell him this was all some elaborate setup. But she didn't. Instead, he was left alone with her words echoing in his head. "Then you'll prove to everyone that you were never worthy of that badge in the first place." That part stung the most. He had spent years believing he was worthy. That he deserved his badge. That he was enforcing the law, keeping order, doing what was necessary, even when people didn't like it. But for the first time, he had to ask himself, had he ever really earned it? The thought made him sick. By the next morning, he had barely slept. He had tried drinking it away, ignoring it, pacing his apartment, but nothing worked. No matter what he did, he kept coming back to the same realization: he had two choices. He could stay here, in this mess he had created, blaming everyone but himself. Or he could see what Laurel was actually offering. It went against every instinct he had to call her. He didn't like admitting he needed anything from her, especially not after how she had humiliated him. But something about the way she had spoken to him, the way she hadn't gloated or tried to ruin him further, made him believe this wasn't just about punishing him. So, against his better judgment, he picked up his phone and dialed the number she had left on a folded piece of paper on his counter. She answered after 2 rings. "You're either about to tell me I was right, or you're about to waste my time," she said immediately. Rylan exhaled sharply. "I'm not saying you were right," he muttered. "So you're here to waste my time," she said, and he could hear the amusement in her voice. He gritted his teeth. "I want to know what exactly you're offering." There was a pause. Then, "Meet me at the city courthouse in an hour." Before he could respond, the line went dead. Rylan cursed under his breath. An hour later, he found himself standing outside the courthouse, feeling like an idiot for even showing up. He almost turned around and left, but before he could, he spotted Laurel stepping out of a black sedan, dressed sharply in a blazer and heels, looking every bit the woman who had the power to ruin his life if she wanted to. She walked up to him without hesitation. "You're on time. That's a good start." Rylan shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. "Mind telling me why the hell we're here?" "You're about to see firsthand what happens to the people you used to arrest," she said. "Come on." Without another word, she led him inside. Rylan followed, feeling completely out of place. He had been in plenty of courthouses before, but always as a cop. He had never been here as an outsider, never been here without a badge. Laurel led him through the halls and into a small courtroom. Inside, a hearing was already underway. A young man, barely 20, sat at the defendant's table, looking terrified. "What's this?" Rylan muttered. "His name is Dion Carter," Laurel said quietly. "He was arrested for resisting arrest and disorderly conduct." "Do you know why?" Rylan frowned. "If he resisted, then it doesn't really matter why, does it?" Laurel turned to look at him. "You tell me." The officer who arrested him claimed Dion was acting aggressively, refused to comply, and tried to run. "Sounds familiar, right?" Rylan didn't respond. Laurel continued. "Except Dion was unarmed. He was stopped because he fit the description of a suspect in a robbery that had already been solved. The officer never asked him a single question before slamming him against a wall and cuffing him. And now, because of that, he's facing up to a year in jail for resisting." Rylan felt his stomach twist. He had heard that phrase 1,000 times. Resisting arrest. It was what cops said when things got messy, when they needed to justify using force. He had written it in reports without thinking twice. Laurel kept her voice low. "How many times have you written up cases like this, Rylan? How many times did you just assume someone was guilty because they didn't immediately comply?" Rylan clenched his jaw. "It's not that simple." "No." Laurel turned back to the courtroom. "Watch." The defense attorney stood, presenting security footage to the judge. The grainy video showed Dion standing on a street corner, looking at his phone. Then, an officer approached. They exchanged a few words. Dion didn't even look hostile, and then, without warning, the cop shoved him against the wall and pulled out his cuffs. Dion flinched, pulled his arms away instinctively, and that was it. That was all it took for the officer to claim he was resisting. Ryland's stomach dropped. He had done that before. Not exactly like that. But close enough. Laurel didn't look at him. She just said, "That could have been me, Ryland." He let out a slow breath, unable to deny it. The judge ruled in Dion's favor. Charges dismissed. But the damage had already been done. The kid had spent weeks in jail, had lost his job, had his name dragged through the system over nothing. As they stepped out of the courtroom, Ryland felt heavier than he had in years. Laurel finally turned to him. "You don't have to like me, Brooks. And I don't care if you ever do. But you need to start asking yourself a serious question: do you actually believe in justice, or do you just like the power that comes with enforcing it?" Ryland swallowed hard. For the first time in his life, he didn't know the answer. Ryland didn't sleep that night. After leaving the courthouse, he had spent hours walking the city, replaying everything Laurel had said, everything he had seen. He had spent his entire career believing he was upholding justice, that his instincts were always right. But the footage of Dion Carter's arrest had shattered something inside him. It wasn't just the fact that the officer had overstepped. It wasn't even the fact that Dion had nearly been locked away for doing nothing wrong. It was the realization that Ryland had done the same thing. Maybe not to the same extreme. Maybe not every time. But he had ignored people's stories. He had assumed the worst about them. He had never thought twice about how his actions might affect their lives. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he had ever really been the good guy. By morning, he made a decision. He called Laurel. She answered on the first ring, as if she had been expecting his call. "That was faster than I thought." Ryland ran a hand through his hair. "You said you wanted me to do something about it. What does that mean?" There was a brief pause before she replied, "Meet me at St. James Community Center." An hour. The line went dead before he could say anything else. Ryland stood outside the community center, feeling like an idiot. It was a small building, nothing fancy, with a few posters taped to the glass doors about free legal aid, youth outreach programs, and job assistance for former convicts. He didn't belong here. And yet, here he was. Laurel was waiting for him just inside, dressed in a simple black blouse and jeans, looking more casual than he had ever seen her. It made her seem less intimidating, but not any less sure of herself. "You're on time again," she said, eyeing him. "That's promising." Ryland crossed his arms. "Mind telling me why I'm here?" Instead of answering, she turned and started walking. "Come on." He followed her down a hallway and into a large, open room filled with mismatched chairs and tables. A group of people, mostly young men, a few older ones, sat in a loose circle, talking quietly. Some looked wary when Ryland entered, their eyes flicking to his stance, his demeanor. They could tell he was a cop, even without the uniform. Laurel gestured for him to sit. "This is the first step." Ryland hesitated but finally lowered himself into a chair. A man in his 40s, dressed in a faded hoodie, glanced at him. "So, you the guy that arrested Laurel?" Ryland tensed, feeling every set of eyes on him. Laurel, to his surprise, only smirked. "Yeah. And now he's here to learn." The man let out a low chuckle. "This should be interesting." Ryland wasn't sure what he expected from the meeting. Maybe accusations, hostility, people waiting to tell him exactly how much they hated cops. But that wasn't what happened. Instead, he listened. One by one, the men in the circle shared their stories, about getting pulled over for no reason, about officers assuming they were dangerous, about being arrested just for looking suspicious. Some had spent months in jail waiting for trials they couldn't afford lawyers for. Some had lost jobs, homes, relationships. One man, barely older than 20, spoke about the first time he had been arrested. "I was 16, he said quietly, staring at his hands. Cops said I matched the description of a car thief. I'd never stolen anything in my life, but they threw me in the back of the cruiser like I was a grown man. My mom cried when she saw me in cuffs. He swallowed. The charges got dropped. But my school found out. They expelled me. Just like that, I was a criminal. I lost everything over nothing. Rylan felt his throat tighten. Because he had said those words before. Matched the description. How many times had he used that excuse? How many people had he cuffed based on nothing more than a gut feeling? Laurel was watching him closely, waiting for his reaction. For once, he didn't try to argue. He didn't have anything to say. After the meeting ended, Rylan lingered outside the building, leaning against the wall. His mind was spinning. Laurel stepped outside and leaned next to him. You survived. Rylan let out a dry laugh. Barely. They didn't sugarcoat anything, she said. But they were honest with you. He ran a hand over his face. I don't know what I expected. I just, never thought about any of it before. That's the problem, Laurel said quietly. A lot of cops don't. They think they're just doing their jobs. But their jobs can ruin people's lives. Rylan was silent for a long moment. Finally, he asked, why are you doing this? Laurel turned to face him fully. Because I don't believe in throwing people away. Rylan looked at her, searching for any trace of pity, but he didn't find it. She wasn't doing this to humiliate him. She wasn't here to see him fail. She was here because she actually wanted him to change. And for the first time, Rylan realized, so did he. Rylan never thought he'd be the kind of guy to sit in a community center, listening to stories from people who had every reason to hate him. And yet, for the past few weeks, that's exactly what he had been doing. At first, he had kept his distance. He sat in the back of the meetings, arms crossed, listening but never speaking. He was still uncomfortable, still wrestling with the ugly truth of his past actions. But the more he heard, the harder it became to ignore. The stories weren't just statistics. They were real people. Real lives. A single bad arrest had cost one man his job. Another had spent months behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, only to be released with no apology, no compensation, nothing. One of the younger guys, maybe 18, spoke about how he no longer went outside after dark, because he didn't want to give anyone a reason to stop him. Rylan had never once thought about how terrifying it must feel to live that way. To always be looking over your shoulder. One evening, after another long session at the community center, Laurel approached him as he was walking out the door. You've been quiet, she noted. Rylan let out a dry laugh. For once. Laurel raised an eyebrow. That self-awareness is progress. He exhaled. I don't know what to say. What am I supposed to do with all of this? Just sit here and feel guilty? She studied him for a moment. No, she said simply. Guilt is useless if you don't do something with it. Rylan frowned. Do what? I can't undo what I've done. No, she agreed. But you can make sure it doesn't happen again. She handed him a folder, and he looked at it warily before flipping it open. Inside were case files, dozens of them. All involving wrongful arrests, excessive force reports, misconduct complaints. Rylan's stomach twisted as he skimmed through them. He recognized some of the names. Not just the victims, but the cops, too. Guys he had worked with. Guys he had once admired. You think I can fix this? He asked bitterly. I think you're in a position to do something about it, Laurel said. You know how the system works. You know how these cases get buried, how officers protect each other. But now you also know what it looks like from the other side. Rylan closed the folder. And what? You want me to testify? Rat out my old colleagues? Laurel didn't blink. I want you to tell the truth. If that means calling out bad cops, then yeah, that's what I want. Rylan clenched his jaw. He knew what that meant. If he spoke out, he would never be welcomed back in the department. Even if they lifted his suspension, even if he somehow got his badge back, he would always be seen as a traitor. He wasn't sure if he was ready for that. As if reading his mind, Laurel said, "You don't owe loyalty to a broken system. You owe it to the people you were supposed to protect." That sentence stuck with him long after she left. A week later, Rylan found himself standing in front of the police review board. He had spent days debating whether or not he would actually go through with this. Whether he would take the easy way out, stay quiet, try to get his job back, pretend none of this had changed him. But it had changed him. He couldn't ignore it anymore. As he sat before the board, the head investigator cleared his throat. "Officer Brooks, are you here to appeal your suspension?" Rylan hesitated. He could say yes. He could fight to get back the life he had before. Instead, he placed the folder Laurel had given him onto the table. "No," he said. "I'm here to tell the truth." The room went silent. Rylan took a deep breath. "I made mistakes. I arrested people without cause. I escalated situations when I didn't have to. I ignored my own bias. And I wasn't the only one." One of the board members narrowed his eyes. "Are you saying there's a pattern of misconduct within the department?" Rylan met his gaze. "I'm saying it's not just a pattern. It's the way things are." He had no idea what would happen next. But for the first time in his life, he knew he was doing the right thing. Rylan Brooks had no idea what his life would look like after that day. When he walked out of the police review board's office, he knew one thing for certain: there was no going back. He had burned every bridge he had left in the department. The moment he chose to tell the truth, he had made enemies of people he once considered friends. The fallout was immediate. His testimony led to an internal investigation. Some officers were disciplined. A few were fired. But most of them, especially the ones higher up, escaped without consequences. The department released a carefully worded statement about evaluating procedures and committing to better training. It was the kind of PR spin Rylan had seen 100 times before. Nothing would change overnight. He knew that. But for the first time, he also knew he wasn't going to be part of the problem anymore. In the months that followed, Rylan had to figure out who he was without the badge. At first, it was brutal. He had spent his entire adult life in law enforcement. Without it, he felt aimless. He applied for jobs, but no one wanted to hire a former cop with a reputation for exposing corruption. His savings ran low. His apartment felt smaller every day. And yet, something inside him refused to regret what he had done. One evening, as he sat in his dark apartment, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Laurel. "Come to the community center tomorrow at noon. It's time to stop feeling sorry for yourself." Rylan rolled his eyes, but he showed up anyway. The center was busier than usual when he arrived. People were setting up tables, arranging stacks of papers, preparing for something. Laurel stood near the entrance, talking to an older man who nodded and walked away before she turned to Rylan. "You're late," she said. "I didn't know I was on a schedule," he muttered. She smirked. "You are now." Before he could ask what that meant, she handed him a stack of folders. "You're helping today." Rylan frowned, flipping one open. Inside were legal resources, job applications, housing assistance forms, things people coming out of the system needed to rebuild their lives. "What is this?" he asked. Laurel crossed her arms. "You spent years locking people up. Now you're going to help them get their lives back." Rylan stiffened. "I'm not a social worker." "No," she agreed. "But you know better than anyone how the system screws people over. So now you're going to use what you know to help. He wanted to argue. To walk away. To say this wasn't his problem. But the truth was, he had spent months asking himself what he was supposed to do now. And maybe, for the first time, he had an answer. The first few weeks were uncomfortable. Rylan was used to people listening to him because they had to. Now, no one owed him their trust. Some people recognized him. A few even confronted him. "You're the cop who got suspended, right?" one man asked one afternoon, arms crossed. Rylan nodded. "Yeah." The man studied him, then huffed. "Figures. Only way a cop ends up on this side is if he pissed off the wrong people." Rylan didn't argue. He just kept showing up. Over time, the tension faded. Slowly, he learned how to listen instead of command. He sat with men and women who had been through hell, people who had lost years of their lives to a system that never cared if they were innocent. He couldn't fix everything. But he could help. And that was more than he had ever done before. One evening, after a long day at the center, he found himself sitting on the building's front steps, staring out at the city. Laurel sat down next to him, handing him a bottle of water. "You look exhausted," she said. "I am," Rylan admitted, twisting the cap open. "How do you do this every day?" Laurel smirked. "It gets easier." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Rylan sighed. "I used to think I had everything figured out. That I knew exactly what my job was supposed to be." Laurel tilted her head. "And now?" "Now." He exhaled. "I think I'm finally starting to understand what justice actually looks like." Laurel studied him for a moment before nodding. "Took you long enough." Rylan huffed a quiet laugh. "Yeah. It did." He wasn't the same man he had been before. And for the first time in his life, he was okay with that. This story isn't just about a rookie cop making a mistake, it's about what happens after that mistake. It's about accountability, about what it truly means to serve justice, and about the uncomfortable reality that power, when unchecked, can do more harm than good. Rylan Brooks started as a man who believed the badge made him untouchable. He thought authority meant control, and he never questioned whether he was using it responsibly. His downfall wasn't just about arresting the wrong person, it was about exposing a mindset that had been ingrained in him for years. But what makes this story compelling isn't his fall, it's his transformation. He could have doubled down, played the victim, or blamed the system for turning its back on him. Instead, he did the hardest thing a person can do, he faced himself. He listened. He learned. And he changed. Laurel Satter represents the kind of person who doesn't just demand justice for herself, she demands it for others. She saw in Rylan what many wouldn't have bothered to look for, the potential to change. She didn't need to help him. She had every reason to walk away. But instead, she offered him a choice, one that forced him to decide what kind of man he truly wanted to be. And that's what makes this a story worth telling. It's not just about exposing corruption, it's about what comes next. About whether people, even those who have done wrong, are capable of growth. Rylan's journey doesn't end with him being a hero. He doesn't magically undo the harm he's caused. But he chooses to do better. He chooses to use what he's learned to help instead of hurt. And in a world where change feels impossible, that choice is everything.